Hello and welcome back to A Christmas Carol Annotate with me. We are now in the middle of, towards the end actually, of stave 3. In the last video we had a look at some settings, some isolated, quite dangerous settings, and the last setting we looked at was people at sea but still celebrating Christmas with excitement and gusto. So now we are going to see these Scrooge's nephew Fred celebrating Christmas. Feel free to pause the video here to go and grab your copy of the text, a highlighter and a pen, and also the revision booklet that we'll be making notes on, which is in the description box below if you haven't printed it off already. So let's make a start. It was a great surprise to Scrooge while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge while thus engaged to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. So Scrooge is back on dry land and visiting people close to him. The ghost takes Scrooge to see how his only living family member views him. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha! If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance." So Fred is well liked by people, and people like to be around him because of his optimistic energy. Dickens, speaking directly about Fred in his narrative, shows how universally liked Fred is. This makes us wonder even more why Scrooge distanced himself from such a likeable person. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily. "Ha ha! Ha 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 ha!" He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." More shame for him. So they're speaking about Scrooge here, when Fred went to visit him to invite him for Christmas. "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, and no doubt it was. All kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. So we've got the use of the superlative sunniest here, to exaggerate Fred's wife's eyes. They seem, from the narration that Dickens gives, like a really good match, Fred and his wife. Perhaps you could argue that Scrooge can see what he missed when letting go of Belle, when he's able to see the Fred and his wife together. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." So Fred is really generous when he speaks about Scrooge. He refuses to be drawn into criticism of Scrooge, so he says nothing to say against him. "I'm sure he is very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha ha ha, that he is ever going to benefit us with it." So Fred's altruistic, unselfish, that means altruistic means unselfish, so you might want to add that to your vocabulary. Nature is emphasized again. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it. So Fred isn't there. Fred doesn't invite Scrooge to Christmas dinner in order to benefit from him financially. We get the impression that Fred isn't as rich as Scrooge, but he doesn't try and form bonds with Scrooge in order to financially gain. He just does it out of the goodness of his heart. So we see how unselfish he is. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. So Fred, pointing out to his wife that Scrooge is only harming himself by refusing to socialize with them, probably rings more true with Scrooge than what it did when Fred spoke directly to him in stave 1. Now that Scrooge has seen what he's missing, it probably rings more true to him than it did when Fred mentioned it in stave 1. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. So throughout this passage, we have Fred's laughter described as a metaphorical infection, suggesting that laughter can be caught or is infectious. And this is really true for Fred, because obviously Dickens has previously narrated what type of laugh Fred has and how well liked he is. So anybody who's around him is constantly laughing and is constantly joyous and merry because of his energy and the way he relates to them. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. So Fred reiterates the idea that Scrooge is only harming himself with his self-inflicted isolation here. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. So here, again we see this unselfish character of Fred throughout this, saying if he goes over and asks Scrooge every Christmas to come and join them for dinner and puts him in a better mood, then perhaps he will then be better towards Bob, his clerk. So he doesn't do it out of his own selfish gains. He does it in a really selfless manner, and the very fact that he's thinking about Bob, somebody who he's completely unconnected with, again emphasizes his altruistic nature. And when he says here, I think I shook him yesterday, when he's speaking about Scrooge, it's interesting that Fred felt he may have moved Scrooge yesterday, as if the ghosts were catching Scrooge at just the right time to begin to enable his redemption. So perhaps the ghosts had planned to arrive to Scrooge at this particular time because of this tiny shaking that Fred caused. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family, and knew what they were about. When they sung a glee of catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing. You might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. So Dickens mentions Little Fan and Scrooge's encounter in stave 2 here to remind us of Little Fan's connection to both Fred and Scrooge. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that Ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindnesses of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game at blind man's buff. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains wherever she went. There he went. So here we've got all of the guests at the Christmas party playing games and having a really good time. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavouring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. So I'm not going into too much detail about this because, again, it's not really necessary. There's not much language to emphasise here. They're just talking about Topper playing games and having a particular likening to the plump sister, Fred's wife's plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not, but when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her necklace, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together, behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's buff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her, but she joined in the forfeits and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right. So Scrooge joins in the games without realizing. This reveals that Scrooge can enjoy himself, but for some sad reason he doesn't. This also reveals that he's not only missing out on forming strong familial ties, but also missing out on having fun. For the sharpest needle Best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. So Scrooge wants to continue to watch the party and play these games. We've got the use of the simile here, where he begs the spirit like a boy. So Scrooge is presented as childlike and innocent here. What I would like you to do is try and find other quotes that you can match this to. So match this childlike, innocent nature of Scrooge's too, and please can you pop them in the comments below whenever you found one, so that I can have a look. I'd really like to see what other quotations you link to this particular quotation, and I'm sure it will help other people out as well. So they will be dotted around the first 3 staves if you look carefully. But this the spirit said could not be done. Here is a new game, said Scrooge. 1/2 hour. 1/2 hour, spirit, only one. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found it out! I know what it is, Fred, I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" So Fred's mockery of Scrooge is good-humoured but hurtful. It probably only confirms what Scrooge expects people to think of him. It's surprising that Fred, who had previously defended Scrooge, is the one to mock him here. Obviously it's out of jest, but it's still quite hurtful for Scrooge to watch, and it's not something we expect of Fred. Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." So by the end of the passage, the family toasts Scrooge, just like the Cratchits do at the end of their Christmas. So perhaps this scene is teaching Scrooge about forgiveness. So although Fred recognises that Scrooge treats people unpleasantly, he still wishes him well. "Well, Uncle's a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is," said Scrooge, his nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in an inaudible speech, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirits were again upon their travels. So we're going to finish here today. It doesn't seem like Scrooge was much affected by what Fred said. If anything, he seemed to really be grateful for their toast at the end, which shows a really changing Scrooge already. Okay, I'm now going to refer to the quote booklet. So here are the quotations that we've picked from this scene. You might want to pause the video here so that you can make notes of this inside your own copy of the booklet. So there are some quotations that Fred says about Scrooge, and then there's also a quotation about Scrooge at Fred's party. So you might want to pause it here so that you can make notes of these. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you are finding our videos useful, please remember to comment, subscribe and like. Especially comment on any other quotations that you can find that you can link to Scrooge as innocent and childlike as well. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.